this is Miss Young, and in this video we're just looking at some topics in English language arts. And we're answering some questions that students might have when they're doing their English homework. Today's question is, what is the structure of a narrative? And how do you find the structure of the narrative? So this is when you have a question where the teacher asks you, describe the structure of the story, or what is the rising action, what is the introduction, what happens in the following action, stuff like that. So today we're going to look closely at the structure of a narrative and explain in a little more detail and give you some tips to help you answer those kinds of questions. So first of all, this is the picture that is most common when we're looking at a narrative or a story. Stories usually take this form. So we have an introduction, and then we have a rising action, and then we have at the tip of the pointy mountain we have the climax, and then after we come down the mountain it's the following action, and then finally it's the resolution. So just a really quick overview. The introduction is where everything is introduced to you. You have the setting, characters, different things that you need to know about the story. Then you have the conflict. The conflict is marked with the star. The conflict, once the conflict is introduced, there's tension, there's trouble, there's things happening, and that's the rising action. The rising action means that the conflict is developing. It's becoming more and more intense, different things are happening, until finally you reach the climax, which is at the tip of the mountain, and the climax is where there's a turning point. So something really exciting happens. All of the rising action builds up to something really exciting, and there's a big turning point in the conflict. Maybe the conflict is resolved. Then you have, after the climax, you have the falling action, which is where everything follows the consequences of the climax. So whatever happened in the climax, you have the consequences of that. And finally, the resolution is where everything just wraps up and the story comes to an end. So how do you pinpoint where everything is in a story? So if you have a novel that you've been reading, or a short story that you've been reading, and the teacher asks you to find where is the introduction, where is the rising action, where is the following action, how do you pinpoint where these things are? Well, a good way to look at this is to focus on 2 points: the conflict, the introduction of the conflict, and the climax. So here we have 2 red dots to indicate the conflict, the introduction of the conflict, and the climax. Once you know where these 2 things are, the rest, the introduction, rising action, falling action, will be easy, really easy to find. So let's look at an example. So here's a story that everyone knows. It's a story of Snow White. So Snow White, the introduction to Snow White is where everything is introduced to us. So we find out where the setting is. We find out the characters, the main characters in the story. But what we're focused on is, okay, so where is the conflict introduced? The conflict in Snow White is person versus person. It's basically Snow White versus her evil stepmother. So the conflict is introduced when the person versus person conflict begins, and that's when Snow White's mom, Snow White's stepmom, has a problem with Snow White. She looks in the mirror, she finds that Snow White is more beautiful, and she becomes angry, and she wants to do something about it. That's when the conflict is introduced. Once that conflict is introduced into the story, then we have the rising action. All the things in the story of Snow White begin to happen. So the evil stepmother begins to plan different things, different ways to harm Snow White, and then Snow White meets the 7 dwarves and all that stuff. Everything. Snow White eats the apple, she falls asleep, everything. It builds up the rising action until the climax. Now, as you remember, the climax is where the conflict is resolved. So the conflict was person versus person, so it was Snow White against her evil stepmother. Now, in the climax, Snow White, it looks like she's defeated by her stepmother because she's asleep. She's poisoned by the apple, right? So the climax is where Snow White, the prince, is going to kiss Snow White and bring her back from her coma or her sleep. That's the climax. It's the most suspenseful, most exciting part of the story, and it's the turning point of the story, because after the prince kisses Snow White, then Snow White, the whole story changes. Everything's resolved, and then you can have the falling action and the resolution. So once you find these 2 points in the story, the point where the first trouble begins, where the conflict is introduced, then you have the most exciting point in the story. Once you have these 2 points, then the rest of the parts of the story are pretty easy to find. So give it a try, and thanks for watching.